Hey everybody, today I'm talking about Raymond Ruyer and his book Neo-finalism. I'm going to start by just going over some of the more general ideas that come up in his book and then go step by step through the first chapter, which is really foundational to the whole book. Ruyer is a defender of the idea of finalism. Finalism is, of course, a view which looks at things like purpose, teleology, goal-oriented action, and it tries to explain them and tries to create a metaphysics which brings them together with mechanism and efficient causality. So Ruyer is not only defending the existence of final causes of teleology, but he's trying to study those realities and figure out what implications those existences have for metaphysics, as well as forming a new way of understanding teleology and purpose, which makes it not be at odds and contradictory to science, which relies on the idea of mechanistic causes and efficient causality. Ruyer starts out by harping on the fact that as scientists, as philosophers, we make statements, we affirm different ideas, and we refute and reject different theories. And all of this activity is really based in this fact that we operate within teleological and finalistic structures. And he wants to extract certain philosophical implications from this fact. And the first one he does in the very beginning of the first chapter is to say that sense exists. And sense here has multiple meanings, as we'll talk about in a second, but it means meaning. It also means to sense something, have an experience of something. But he's really harping here on the idea of meaning and something having sense versus being senseless, in the sense that the world of mechanistic causality or of reductionism or behavioralism or something like that is a pure biological and physiological fact that has no meaning. It's a meaningless universe, so it's a senseless world. And Ruyer is really against any philosophy or any theory in science that negates the possibility of sense and meaning. Ruyer points out early on that if we are going to accept a view of the world that accommodates meaning and sense as well as teleology, we are going to have to at least provisionally see kind of two worlds. And here we can think of Platonic and Kantian philosophies, in which we have ideality as one realm separate from spatiality and embodiment. Finality, working towards a purpose, having a goal, it involves ideality that is not physically determined by the conditions of a body extended in space or of certain movements. It is neither space nor something extended in space. But Ruyer says that this two worlds view is really just the correlate of an anti-finalist worldview. So if we start with an anti-finalist worldview in which everything is reducible to a senseless material substratum, and this senseless material substratum is really resolved into quantities in space, I mean, if that's all that matter can be, then finality must be this otherworldly realm that is completely separate from that spatial, senseless realm. But even when he first gives us this idea and hints at this idea, he shows that really what's at stake is a view in which we don't have two worlds, in which matter and the world of ends and finalism and purpose and goals and consciousness, where those aren't truly at odds with one another and where they're not truly two separate worlds, that he wants to hint at this possible way in which we could see past this dualism. And so what we really need, and what Ruyer is really giving us, is a new way of thinking. And this will require on our part an effort and the invention of new concepts. And Ruyer invents concepts. He invents, I'll give you a list right now: work activity, equipotentiality, absolute survey, and absolute surfaces. These are all concepts that he invents in order to get us to what he's calling neo-finalism, a new view of finalism. And he invents these concepts so we can kind of follow along with him. But in fact, we are going to have to be inventive ourselves and create the meaning of these concepts within our own subjectivity, within our own experience, in order for them to really, restructure our world such that we don't have this dualistic two worlds view. So we actually have to transform our way of thinking, and he helps show us a path to doing that. Now, Ruyer wants to say any metaphysics that denies mechanism and efficient causality will be doomed. He's not calling for a anti-materialist or an anti-scientific view. He also thinks that if you deny finality and teleology, or anything that is for the sake of something, right? I do something for the sake of something. I act with a certain purpose and a certain goal. If you deny that, you're also doomed. So his goal here is really not to deny mechanism and efficient causality, but to say that if you deny finality, then you're going to be going completely wrong. And also, if you deny mechanism and efficient causality, you will be going wrong. And he points out that actually mechanistic views, specifically, of nature are naturally finalistic, or tend to be finalistic. And here he brings up people like Descartes and Newton and Kant. For all of them, the physical world is mechanistic. It works mechanistically. But it has some kind of hidden structure behind it, which is teleological. And every machine, he points out, is created with a purpose and has its purpose in the actions that it performs because of someone outside it who created it. And really what Ruyer wants us to get past is this correlation between mechanistic worldviews and creationist worldviews, where God becomes basically an engineer who builds a machine. He wants to get us past this idea that there's an external program that is being realized within the processes of an organic body and the processes of nature. He wants to get us past that kind of dualistic view. Ruyer tackles these problems by attempting to form an argument that critiques both idealist and materialist forms of AntiFinalism. An idealist form of AntiFinalist would be found in Spinoza, for example, or in a kind of reductive reading of Spinoza that doesn't give enough credit to Spinoza's idea of conatus. And then the materialist AntiFinalist views are pretty obvious to us at this point in the semester, but they're really made most obvious by behavioralists and physiologists, reductive physiologists. So he wants to argue against those people on the one hand, the anti-finalists, but also against the creationist and the spiritualist finalism. And by those terms, I mean any kind of finality or, purposive structure which has an a priori determined schema to it. Like, this is what it means to be an adult, and this is what an adult does. Taking that formula in this kind of Aristotelian view of biology, where forms are sort of created by a demiurgic or engineer god, or from nature perhaps, and that there's no evolution there. Those forms are static and predetermined for eternity. And we can also think here of Uxkol, whose view of the plan of nature had this external model that becomes incarnate, but that there's no kind of communication between them. There's just a kind of top-down manufacturing relation between them. And Uxkol follows two important areas of scientific research. One is neuroscience and the science of the brain, and the other is embryology, the study of embryogenesis, going from seed to individual adult, that growth process of embryogenesis. And here are two quotes. "The brain is an embryo that has not finished its growth. The embryo is a brain that begins to organize itself before organizing the external world. In the adult organism, the brain is an area that has remained embryonic. So for Ruyer, the relation between brain and embryology is incredibly important. Embryology is this developmental process in which movements and processes take place that shape the organs that become the organism, right? You start with sort of unorganized matter, you might say, which gradually gains order, and the organs take on a certain form that remains consistent through that organism's life. You know, you have to form a heart, and if the heart were to transform into another organ, life would be terminated. So in embryogenesis, there's this process of starting from something open and provisional and developmental to landing somewhere where the structure and the pattern and the organization have to be maintained in order to keep that organism alive. So what the brain does, according to Ruyer, is it remains open. It's as if the embryonic space of the early stages of embryogenesis was preserved in the brain. The brain holds open. This is the idea of neuroplasticity. The brain can form sort of networks and patterns and things like that, but the closure with which those patterns are formed is always provisional. It always remains possible for the plasticity of the mind, for the neuroplasticity to reopen those structures. Ruyer says that there's a moment when the brain is a finished organ. You can think here of forming a habit or something like that. At a certain point, we learn how to do a certain action, like let's say play the piano or a certain skill, and that wires our brain, right? It forms a mechanism, and it differentiates what was previously undifferentiated. So when it creates this kind of machine, this machine that becomes planned out, a certain circuit becomes energized, and a process perfectly enacts all of the parts in the way that it was planned out to. In that kind of situation, and this is an aspect of our daily life in getting around, what needs to happen is that this embryonic potential needs to be configured into one configuration, and only one configuration, which is useful at a time, right? When we want to do a task, there's a certain order of behaviors which will achieve that task, and an alternate assembly of actions will have a different outcome, right? So in order to pursue a certain end, the brain must temporarily become like an organ. It must fix its organization. You know, the heart needs to always be pumping blood. Well, in order to walk somewhere, I need to always be continuing in my process of walking step by step. If I change that order, a different outcome will come about. So in that sense, the brain is this space which retains its embryonic nature, but also lends that embryonic nature to becoming determinate within a certain path of actions and a certain coordination and configuration. On the one hand, organizing our sensory input with effective pathways. So I have certain sensations, and then those help organize my behavior. You know, if you're walking somewhere and your senses tell you that there's something in the way, like a chair in the way, then you respond to that. And all of that way of organizing our sensory and effector states is, you know, guided by one structure and one configuration. And in order to actually walk across the room and avoid the chair and all of that, we have to stay on the same plan. What the brain makes possible is switching from one plan to another plan as soon as one is different. The sort of embryonic space of these developmental pathways remains intact after we choose one path. We choose that path, we go down it, and at the end of that path, we can start from scratch again. After acting, we seamlessly move to another action. We form a sort of norm, a theme. We give a certain sense to our action. We say, I'm walking across the room. The meaning of that action is that I'm going to get to the other end of the room. If I begin walking and I end up not halfway across the room, but on the other side of the room, I'm going to immediately, look at what I did, inspect what I've done, compare it to that norm, that theme, that sense of my action that I had, and say, oh, I've not fulfilled that goal. I need to adjust and reorganize my action. Every moment in life, we are invited to open up new sense-making potential. This is really what the brain makes possible because of this sort of embryonic ability. He also describes this by saying that the differentiations that the brain makes possible, again, differentiations here means to take this potential and side with one potential within it and, exclude other potentials. So my goal is to walk across the room. That cancels out other possibilities, not walking somewhere else, going and sitting down or whatever. When I make a differentiation, when the brain chooses a certain path, this path that it chooses, unlike the differentiations with embryogenesis, is reversible rather than irreversible. So in embryogenesis, the transformation must be irreversible. This area of the pre-articulated matter needs to become the heart, and the heart needs to become a certain structure that always repeats in the same way. It needs to keep beating in order to keep blood going to the whole body, and that process needs to go to that structure and not reverse back and undo that. So all of the processes that create the organs of the body in ontogenesis must be irreversible, but the ones that happen within the brain are reversible. And what he means is that the brain does not become irreversibly stuck in one operation. The heart in the ontogenetic process needs to become structured such that it sticks to that operation. And if the brain did this, it wouldn't be a brain anymore. It would become some other organ that did something. But I would argue here that the idea of reversibility is really only a conditional sense of reversibility. It's not absolute irreversibility that, goes against the idea of irreversibility within thermodynamics. It doesn't break with an underlying reversibility of the brain's activity, which manifests in our habits of thought. Now, a habit is something that comes about through an irreversible process, so that's why I think that this is evidence still that there's an irreversible process underneath the brain's reversible process. But what's really important here is that a habit can be changed, a habit can be broken. You can, an old dog can learn new tricks, so to speak. The norm is able to arise. So a norm arises in the ontogenetic process. I'll explain that a bit more in a minute. But in the brain, and that norm creates a pattern of behavior, and as the pattern of behavior is repeated, it becomes mechanistic, it becomes automatic, right? That's the idea of habit. And so in the process of habit, you have this irreversible movement from norms to machines, or from themes to structures. A theme is, and a norm and a goal are basically goals. A theme and a norm are goals. We work towards fulfilling this norm. If I'm going to walk across the room, there are actions I could take which would fall short of that norm, and as I carry out that action, I will say, this isn't fulfilling the norm that I anticipated, right? And a theme has the same kind of idea. The heart has a certain theme to it. Its goal, its purpose, what it does, its meaning are, their ability to play into the organism's vital function. And so what happens in the ontogenetic process is that norms and themes are turned into machines and structures. And what the brain is capable of doing with its neuroplasticity is reevaluating its norms and going back from machine to a new norm, reevaluating the meaning of actions. Ruyer also says that the brain is an organ for the creation of organs, and that really gets at this idea. Its creation need not replicate for perpetuity. It creates these organs, or these machines, and they can be prolonged by our will, by our effort, by our work activity, as he likes to call it, or by habit, right? The persistence of a tendency. But it's always possible to reshape these tendencies. It's always possible to shift our habits. Let me just say a bit more before jumping directly into chapter 1 about what Ruyer means by ideality, by theme, and by norm. A lot of this is coming from Merleau-Ponty and Merleau-Ponty's idea of behavior. Motricity, right, this ability to move around, and motricity always implies a kind of circuit between sensory motor processes, our sensations, and the way that our movements are constantly reevaluated based on our perceptions, right? So our motricity involves the establishment of a norm of behavior. When I learn how to turn a doorknob, I'm not only, forming certain movements into a shape, I'm excluding certain actions which are ineffective, and I'm defining a certain norm of that behavior which has deviations from that norm which fail to fulfill that norm. And we can also think about his descriptions of the striving within the body to optimize our perceptual clarity. There are original finalistic goals and norms existing in the body, in which the body appraises our experience and strives to improve our perception and our motricity and all of these embodied activities that have immanent intelligence to them. And these themes, these goals, these objectives, these norms are reworked by art, science, and philosophy in different ways. So really we take up our organic finality, you might say, and evolve it and develop it in different directions when we do art, science, and philosophy. Art is an effort to make something that gives us the impression of truth, beauty, or existential depth, right? Science is an effort to behold or to care for and communicate the truth. And philosophy is an effort to integrate the activities of art and science together. And we know each of these realities by their intention. We know what art is, or what science is, or what philosophy is, by its ability to pursue a certain goal, which are the goals I just said, and we judge between better and worse philosophy, science, and art by sort of comparing one to another at how well they achieve their goal, how well they fulfill this finalism that is their basis. And I want to just say one quick thing about sense and signification before moving on to chapter 1. Ruyer wants to make a distinction between sense and signification. This idea already arose with Merleau-Ponty. Sense is, at least for us, for humans, is more akin to the context in which a statement makes sense, rather than it is the designation of a meaning by a sign, what we mean by signification, right? So sense is more the context and the milieu in which something appears meaningful, rather than the meaning of something which is marked by a symbol or a name or a sign. It's that larger context which makes possible signification and has a more primordial ontological and phenomenological reality to it. In more primordial levels of consciousness, so not necessarily human consciousness, animals, for instance, have sense without it becoming signification. It's the way that an animal understands the meaning and the reasons for its action. It is able to adjust its action when it senses that it is not achieving its purpose. An animal grasps the sense of its action without representing them or evaluating them in representations. They evaluate the world by means of their sense, their understanding, right, of action, of their action, but they never turn back and evaluate sense itself. They never turn and evaluate and question the goal-orientedness of their action. They evaluate the world based on their goal-orientedness. So signification is really a way of externalizing sense. It turns sense into a tool of communication in which those who use the words look at these things from the outside. Ruyer thinks that even an embryonic process has sense, and it experiences something, has a kind of primary consciousness to it. It does not know itself from the outside, but the embryonic muscle, he says, knows its own nature and sense, and enacts a goal and a consciousness by means of consciousness and memory, which guide the transformation. And this consciousness is clear and complete, clear and complete form of consciousness. It's not a kind of degraded and confused consciousness. Okay, let me jump now into chapter 1, which is called the axiological cogito. And in this chapter, Ruyer really sets his ideas in relation to the history of philosophy, and then presents a argument which attempts to prove, basically, the validity of finalism and the insufficiency of all anti-finalism. And he does come back to this theme later, but he tries to do it on basically the most obvious level of this contradiction in anti-finalism. But he starts with the idea of sense. And sense is really fundamental here, and this idea of sense is really continuous with the work of Merleau-Ponty. We can think about this as a kind of gradual development in the history of philosophy, going back to Husserl's idea of essences and Bergson's idea of qualitative multiplicity. Bergson's idea of qualitative multiplicity applied to Husserl's idea of essences is really what Merleau-Ponty means by sense. It's not essence in the old metaphysics of medieval philosophy, which is these kind of fixed entities like Platonic ideas. The essence is a qualitative potentiality that structures and helps organize the world in the way that sense does for Merleau-Ponty. So Ruyer says that there's been a shift from these questions of existence to questions of sense. And this he's taking in a metaphysical paradigm. In the medieval times and in early modern philosophy, we asked about truth. Is it true? And the meaning, the shift in emphasis is towards meaning now. What does it mean? So we go from is it true to what does it mean? And he says that atheism is more or less the denial of sense in nature, or the alteration of the meaning and origin of sense. And he shows that, or he argues here, that the medieval metaphysical arguments of a priori and the ontological arguments, so these are arguments for the existence of God. The ontological argument is for the existence of God, and we can think of the a priori argument as being rooted in a Kantian philosophy. So when we want to establish a metaphysics, we either say that God is the arbiter of meaning, or we say that the subject is the arbiter of meaning. And that leads to this Kantian view. All sense-making comes from a priori structures of consciousness. And what he wants to say is that we need to shift these arguments, either the Kantian argument or the ontological arguments for the existence of God and things like that, to a question of what he calls the axiological cogito. But he says these arguments have the same shape, these arguments for the axiological cogito have the same shape as the medieval metaphysical questions and the Kantian metaphysical questions. In the same way that Descartes tries to show that denying the existence of God is a contradiction, likewise, he wants to say that denying the sense of finality is a contradiction. Really, the relation between sense and finality is essential here. The word sense in French, sens, means not only meaning and sensations and common sense, things like that, it also means directionality. And we saw this in Merleau-Ponty. And directionality means orientedness, being pointed towards something, which is an aspect of purpose and finality and goals. When you act with a goal, you are oriented, you are directed, right? There's a certain vector to your actions, and there's a certain way of understanding the meaning of those actions, right? There's a sense that those actions have. When we act, we appraise our actions, and that appraisal points to the fact that our action has meaning, and we can enact certain actions which don't fulfill that meaning, which don't lend themselves to that goal. And so sense implies finality, and in order to retain the idea of sense, in order for the world to have meaning, in order to have meaning in your metaphysics, you have to have finality. That's Ruyer's big point here. Sense and finality mean directionality, aim, coherence, continuity, And all of these things are implied in activity, human activity, work, doing something. So he takes those facts, basically, of experience and says they imply finality and sense, and it is absurd to try to create a philosophy which denies the reality of finality and sense, because these are immediate realities within our experience. And that's where he kind of starts, but he tries to go one step further than that with the idea of the axiological cogito by looking at the fact that we speak and the fact that we seek the truth. In speaking, in making propositions, in seeking the truth, we follow ends, we pursue goals, right? And he says that the behavioralist mixes fact with true proposition. So if a behavioralist says there's no such thing as finality, right? If a behavioralist is an anti-finalist and tries to convince us of anti-finalism, they mix up a true proposition with a fact, and they actually negate the reality of a true proposition. The statement that they make is nothing more than an effect of a stimuli, right? That's the basis of their view of reality. A behavioralist denies that there is any finality or intent or sense-making within their proposition. It's a pure effect, a fact that is neither right or wrong. It is just an event that happens because of some causal antecedent event, right? There is something happens in the body, some kind of stimuli affects the body, and all of a sudden they blurt out this statement. I mean, that's all that the behavioralist can say of their own statement. And so his point is that the behavioralist negates the possibility of anti-finalism by making a statement, or they negate the possibility that their statement has any meaning or value or truth to it. In a way, what he's saying is that the rejection of sense, the rejection of finality, proves the existence of sense and finality. Any endorsement whatsoever of a view, any endorsement of a truth, that endorsement goes against the possibility of reductionism and of behavioralism and of anti-finalism, because in order to endorse something, there has to be a goal, there has to be a consciousness which chooses some truth, which affirms some reality, which asserts some truth. And in order to refute and reject and all of these things, you have to have some underlying activity within the person, which is speaking and attempting to say something and is seeking the truth. So the endorsement of reductive causality, a paradigm of reductive causality, calls it a causalist, or a behavioralist, those endorsements are actually evidence of the reality of sense and of finalism. Ruyer then goes on to examine Gestalt psychology, which he sees as attempting to do better than the behavioralist, but also failing. And here he looks at Kohler, and we had talked about Gestalt psychology in relation to Merleau-Ponty. It had a very profound effect on Merleau-Ponty. He says that according to the Gestalt psychologist, an act, right, something we do, here we have to grant some kind of subjectivity to activity. An act has a dynamic, non-mechanical nature, and that it implies a psychological tension within the task, and an end to be achieved by that task. And so we stay within this kind of tension in order to pursue the task and achieve the end. And all of this corresponds to some underlying dynamic content, which is the body and the processes within the world. And all of this implies a plurality of types of causes, and here this kind of goes back to Aristotle. It implies a material cause, a formal cause, and a purposive or teleological cause. But he says that this view is no better than the behavioralist, at least philosophically speaking. All of these descriptions and explanations they don't amount to saying anything more than that the effort of Kohler himself as a scholar writing a book, his effort that he puts forward in creating a theory is nothing but an effort to relieve the tension in his experience. This tension and this effort have no truth value, but are just ways of releasing the tension associated with the need to write a paper. It's a way of achieving relaxation. The underlying dynamic content, the body, is a fact that still remains determined by a stimuli. There's this feeling of tension, and all that writing does is relieve the tension and achieve a kind of relaxation in face of that experience of tension. Ruyer wants to point us towards a view that is not falling back on some mechanistic and causal determinate series that leads to affirming and asserting an idea. He wants to say that there is necessarily a reality of freedom underlying these actions. And freedom for Ruyer consists in working towards an end according to a norm. So it's a type of freedom that is necessarily engaged with the world, which is necessarily embodied in physical actions, but that also relies on ideality, the idea of a norm, of some kind of theme and some kind of meaning, some kind of sense, which helps order and survey and inspect the actions as they unfold in time. Ultimately, he wants us to see that all searching for the truth implies finality. And so if we are to take up an anti-finalist perspective, we will ultimately always fall back into a contradictory position in which we have to say that what we say about the world, these ideas that the world has no meaning, that the world, basically the anti-finalist position in general becomes meaningless. And that's obvious because it has to deny meaning. So its phrases cannot be meaningful, nor can they achieve some kind of truth. And he wants to put us back in touch with sense of our actions as philosophers, as scientists, as artists. And that sense is a search for truth, this kind of fierce and heroic care for the truth, as he calls it at one point. Anytime we say, I suppose, we already assert a certain level of freedom. In order to hypothetically think about something, we are always making an assertion and we are affirming something, and we are therefore free in that action. And this is exactly what he calls the axiological cogito. In order to presuppose an idea that we logically consider and use reason to prove or disprove, this always implies, prior to that operation, that we seek the truth and that we know in advance some criteria, some norm by which to evaluate true from false, that there is truth and that there's false, and that certain things can be evaluated as false and other things can be evaluated as true. In general, what he wants to say is that if we have a theory, and the theory in metaphysics or in philosophy or in science, it implies that we are asserting something. And if we're asserting something, that implies that we've made some kind of search, we've made some kind of appraisal, we've taken things and surveyed them and looked at them and appraised them, and that whatever the content of our assertion may be, it implies some primary understanding of truth, some fundamental aspect of our consciousness that compares things and surveys them and says that some are closer to the norm and some are farther from the norm. It also implies some freedom, some decision, some follow-through, that we go from search to assertion. There's no determinate reason why we should look at things and then appraise them and then assert something about them. That all requires our freedom. And it also requires some sense. Something makes sense, and that we would do this for some reason, that our action in searching and asserting has some meaning for us. All assertion, basically, this is a summary, all assertion implies the existence of senseful activity, of meaningful activity, of appraisal, right? Of searching for the truth, of striving. So there are a lot of overlaps between Bergson and Spinoza and Ruyer, and now each one of them forms a slightly different view, but they all have what we might call a compatibilist view of freedom. Their views are rooted in a kind of phenomenological evidence of striving and of understanding and of acting. We all act and think and strive, and we realize our existence. We know that we exist, and we know that there are realities which have a fundamental way of being that is striving and searching, and so based on that primary evidence of the reality of striving, there is this immanent finalism, this interior to the act itself, where a norm and a theme and meaning can emerge within a process of enacting and striving for something, right? And that is an axiological basis of the philosophy of finalism and of, for Spinoza, you know, the idea of freedom, because it is the basic reality that takes us forward and gives us understanding, and through which we are able to construct metaphysics and science and art. If it wasn't for our freedom and our striving, none of these things would ever have arisen in the first place. In a way, what Ruyer is saying is that there are metaphysical implications of the fact of our assertion. And that fact of our assertion is not merely a effect of a stimuli and the condition of our bodies.